Our next big lecture is going to be on ancient revised civilizations and how they were similar and different socially, politically, economically, and how they use language and religion to rule. We're going to focus on not just individual ancient revised civilizations, but kind of all of them at the same time to kind of figure out how did people in the beginning, when they start to become civilized, when they start creating these cities of 1,000+ people, how did they organize themselves and rule? Ancient river valley civilizations started to emerge because those Neolithic villages that we talked about in Unit 1 started having a huge population boom. And that population boom was a direct result of the domestication of the animals that we talked about and domestication of seeds. What started to happen? With a surplus of food, you have a surplus of people. The more people you have, the more need that a civilization or a community has to come together. So ancient revised civilizations will be known as the cradle of civilizations because it is these major ancient revised civilizations that we talked about before: Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus River Valley civilization, and China, that become the first 4 major ancient river valley civilizations that leads to all other civilization in the world. Right? So what do these 4 major ancient river valley civilizations have in common? Well, first, they have the world's first cities. They have the perfect locations, like we talked about before, to allow cities to be developed, right? Remember, they're right on the river. They have great trade. They have defense. And so what else would they need to become a civilization? Well, what do they need? The first thing they need is a government. When you start having a few hundred people and then a few thousand people come live in one area, there's going to be fighting. There's going to be disputes. There's going to be arguments. And so the best way to end those arguments is to have a government. You're going to have one leader who's going to have a final say in matters. And that one leader will run the civilization, right? What else do you need? Well, people start to come together in communities because they need public works. Well, what is public works? Public works are things like irrigation systems, right? Today our public works are people, that are construction workers, maybe for VDOT, who build our roads. Well, the same type of thing you need in ancient river civilizations. You need people to build roads, or to build harbors, or to protect the ships in the harbors, right? You need a government that is willing to tax people, collect that tax, and then create an army for defense. I mean, even today with our civilization here in the United States of America, I mean, we spend billions of dollars on defense. So that's a huge factor. Another thing that you start to notice with these 4 major ancient river civilizations is from the very beginning, they start to emerge into social classes. And I'll talk about that in a minute, right? But the reason why they emerge into social classes is because they start to have job specialization, right? You start to have people who start getting trained in certain jobs, and those jobs that they get happen to be determined by their social class, right? So if you are a noble man and you are the king's brother, well, then your children are going to be princes, or they're going to get jobs like becoming a priest, right? If you're born if you're born into a family of a farmer, then you're probably going to have to be a farmer. If your dad's a little bit wealthier and he's a merchant and he's made a lot of money off of trade, well, then maybe you get to be a scribe, somebody that's paid to write, or some other type of job specialization like that, some middle class job. But from the very beginning of ancient river civilization, job specialization takes off, and that leads to distinctions between different classes. Just wanted to give you a picture in case you forgot where those ancient river valley civilizations were located. Here are the first ancient river valley civilizations. Don't you forget the Nile, right? Egypt, Mesopotamia, Tigris and Euphrates, Indus, the Indus River, China, the Yangtze River. Heredity is the factor in determining who got what in ancient river valley civilizations. The eldest son always received the inheritance, and this is something that will go on for thousands of years. Even with the Greeks and the Romans, the firstborn son gets the inheritance, gets the land, gets his father's title. The younger siblings would be at the mercy of the older siblings, and sometimes this would actually cause wars between families, especially in the social class of kings. because an older son from a king may be challenged by a younger son of the same king after the king has passed, and they'll fight over the throne. And so that's happened numerous times throughout every ancient river civilization. But as you see in this picture here, you can see that it also creates a concept called dynasty. Because of the concept of heredity, because of this idea that you deserve to get something because your father will be able to pass it down to you after he died, regardless of what you did to help him achieve that, kings and queens or pharaohs of Egypt will be able to create these family-run governments called dynasties. And when I mean family-run, I literally mean family-run, kind of like the mob, right? So if I'm going to run Babylon, then I would take my younger sister, have her go rule the southern part of Babylon. I would take my brother, he'd rule the eastern part. I would take my favorite cousin, have her go rule the northern part, and take my other favorite cousin and have him go rule the eastern part or the western part of the county. And then together, those guys would work together to collect taxes, to rule different areas, and then they would all, of course, report back to me, right? And then I would have the final say in all matters. But creating dynasties, like you see in the pictures, Mesopotamia and Egypt were prime examples of this. China will also do it. You create these family-run governments for years, right? So when I die, my children then will take it over, and then my children's children take it over. And eventually, that leads to war, because other families who may be related to me will also challenge my family for control over, an ancient River Valley civilization. The only way the concept of dynasty would work for ancient River Valley civilizations is if ancient River Valley civilization people believed in the concept of social class. And social classes actually start in ancient River Valley civilization. It is the idea that you deserve your pay, or you deserve your status in society based on your occupation or based on your family's inheritance. Right? So if you look at the picture above, you'll see the pharaoh up top. Right? And that, of course, in ancient Egypt would be the ruling class, the ruling family. Right? What would be next? Well, in ancient Egypt, like in Mesopotamia, you would have an upper class. All right, who was the upper class? If you look to the left of the picture with the guy that looks like he's a little bit in a skirt over there, that's actually a Mesopotamian priest, right? So priests are people of the royal family who is not the ruling, who's not the ruler, the king or the pharaoh, would be part of this royalty or get to become a priest, right? What's next? Well, on the other side, if you look at where it says school, well, the next social class would, of course, be a middle class type of occupation. And middle class people were usually merchants, people who bought and sold goods, or artisans, people who made things by their hands, because that's what artisans mean, and who got to sell things, right? So in this picture where you see school, that's definitely the artisan class of scribes. These were people whose fathers were probably wealthy merchants who were able to have enough money to go to school, and they learned how to read and write, right? Something that very few people in ancient River Valley civilizations could do. So these guys could create a job where you could pay them to read and write for you. All right. What was close to the end? Well, the middle picture there. And the reason why I put that in the middle of the slide is because farmers made up 80%, if not sometimes 90% of ancient River Valley civilizations. Ancient River Valley civilizations would not have survived without the farmer, right? Now, these are the lower class in society. These are peasants. They usually just make enough food to live and enough food to sell to make a little bit of money so they can buy some more seeds for next year. They did not live in the city, right? They lived on the outskirts of the city. Right? Well, who do we have at the bottom? In social classes, in all ancient River Valley civilizations, the bottom of the social class was slaves. Now, how did ancient River Valley civilizations get slaves? They got them by going to war. When one civilization challenged another, and the one civilization that lost, their men were probably killed, and their wives and children were sold into slavery. Now, slavery is very different from the ancient River Valley civilization from U.S. slavery. All right, U.S. slavery is called chattel slavery. That's something that is, that we'll get into later on in our semester, but that's a different type of slavery that the world has ever seen, right? Ancient slavery is something where you could work your way out of being a slave. Ancient slavery was only based on being prisoner of war unless you were a criminal, and then they could sell you to another ancient valley civilization as a slave. But your children were always free. All right. So if I was taken captive as a child at the age of 5, well, I would be a slave. But when I got older and got married and had a child, then my child would be free. All right. And there's numerous cases in ancient valley civilizations where children of slaves actually rose up to be great generals, if not rulers of civilization. So there was way more social mobility than what you would see in the U.S. in regards to slavery. Another factor about slavery, before I end this slide, is that slavery was not based on race. U.S. slavery was based on race, right? This slavery is not based on race. Ancient valley civilizations had no concept of race. They had no concept of color. The only reason why people would follow the social class is because ancient River Valley civilizations created economic patterns that we still follow today. And I'll give you an example. I'll explain better what I mean. Well, what do I mean? Well, why would a peasant take, probably a harder life, working longer hours, having to deal with, harder problems than a prince's son, right? Why would he never question that authority and want to overthrow that, the pharaoh, the king, and his family? Well, one reason was because when ancient River Valley civilizations create economies, people start justifying their social class based on how much money they make. And this is a very American, concept, right? Like, we say in America, right? Money talks, right? So what starts to happen to create these economic patterns? Well, the first thing that has to happen is you have to have a surplus in agriculture. People have to have so much food that they don't need food any longer, right? They have so much food that they need to develop something else that people want. So that hunter-gatherer society where all you do is wake up and look for food has completely changed, right? People are not waking up looking for food because food is brought to them. They have a marketplace. They have people cooking for them. And they have job specialization where that may not be their job to make the food. They have so much surplus of items that they start turning to the concept of currency, right? So people start taking very precious metals like bronze or copper, and eventually China will start making silver and gold coins, and out of these very valuable resources that people will actually to fight for, right? So things like bronze used to be used for tools. Well, they're still used for tools, but they also become very important in buying things, such as creating little bronze coins to go buy bread at the marketplace. The major economic pattern, though, for ancient River Valley civilizations is the need for agriculture. Agriculture is the factor in why the 4 big ancient River Valley civilizations, the oldest ones, right? Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and the Indus, all became these great civilizations that will lead to all the other civilizations, is because they invested in agriculture. They took the time to create better plows, to create irrigation systems. And if you look at the irrigation systems at the bottom of the slide, you'll see they were very complex, right? So they would work together as a community. They would tax people. They would hire people to be, these early civic engineers who could figure out, how we can invest in our community and how we can invest in our farmers so we can have this surplus of food that we could sell to other civilizations that may not have the same type of food that we have, right? And investing in agriculture also means that you're going to invest in better plow technology. Besides investing in better plow technology, you're also going to invest in better metals. And one metal that will become crucially important in changing ancient River Valley civilization is iron, right? So Iron actually is going to come out of the Middle East with this group of Assyrians who are going to learn that you can take iron ore, you can melt it down, you can make weapons, and you can make cheap weapons that you can cast very quickly if something would happen to them, and pretty tough weapons that would even replace bronze. It is this use of metal, this concept of metal, this idea that we can mine metals and use them from weaponry to coins that become a crucial factor in economies of ancient River Valley civilizations. Well, with better weapons and with cheaper weapons, like iron weapons, people are going to create complex trade patterns. We know for sure that the Egyptians traded with Mesopotamians. The Mesopotamians traded with the people of the Indus. And for the first time in history, we have our first world trade patterns where people would get goods from various areas and sell them to other areas. And this is another reason why currency has to get formed in ancient River Valley civilizations, right? There has to start being this understanding of a global economy. This idea that, that wheat in Egypt can be sold in Mesopotamia, and it can be sold at a price that both of the merchants would agree to. Now, you cannot have a strong economy without a written record system. You have to have writing. And writing will happen because the world's first cities in places like Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and China have to have information on who owes them what and where that money is going to and how much money is being taken, or how much money is getting taken in, or inventory of their goods, right? So writing gets created in all ancient River Valley civilizations, and all ancient River Valley civilizations start their writing by using pictograms. Now, we use pictograms today. So what are pictograms? Pictograms are basically symbols that represent words or concept, right? So if I look at the phone, I'll know that if I see a picture of a phone, then I'll know that I could make a call there if needed, right? The picture of the plus sign means that you can get some medical attention. The envelope means you probably got an email in your box, right? We all know about the handicap sign. And so here are different pictograms that we use in society today, right? The picture represents the word or the concept, like eating, like you see in the pictogram, right? So the fork and the knife in the pictogram necessarily do not represent a fork and a knife. It represents the concept that you can come in here and get some food, right? So pictograms are all created in ancient River Valley civilizations at the very beginning, but there's a problem, right? So for 5 seconds, just look at the pictograms that I have given you on this slide and try to form a complete sentence, right? Go. Yeah, can't do it, can you? There's no way that you can take pictograms and create them into a perfectly structured sentence that's going to make sense to everybody in the classroom, right? So this is the problem that ancient River Valley civilizations have to deal with. They create these pictograms that represent words and sounds, like they may draw an ox to represent the word work. But the problem is that when they start forming these global economies where they're going to be buying and selling and trading currencies, that doesn't work any longer. It's just too simple, and it gets too confusing for people to understand, right? So they have to form a written language that's a lot more detailed. As you read in Guns, Germs, and Steel, the first complex writing system came out of Mesopotamia. It actually came out of a city-state in Mesopotamia called Sumer, and this writing system is called cuneiform. Cuneiform was the first written language that was not pictograms. So each of the symbols represented a sound of the language, and you had to put those symbols together in order to understand what the writing meant, in order to create words, right? So words were a better way of recording of your economy or even your history and your religious ceremonies. So writing becomes very complex in ancient Mesopotamia. Now, why do they use wedge shape? Why are there no zeros or C's or S's in this language? Well, because in ancient Mesopotamia, there's one geographical feature that they're lacking, and you know that to be trees, right? They don't have they don't have tree bark to make paper. So if you don't have tree bark to make paper, but you have to have a written record, the only way you're going to be able to create that written record is by using the dirt and the sand from the desert area, right? And so you would take that natural resource, you would, mix it, and you would make you a nice little clay tablet that you would bake and chisel in your written records. So if you're chiseling in something, it's probably a lot easier to make a wedge shape than it is to try to make an S, because once you chisel wrong, there's no eraser. You don't get to back that back up and start again. You have to throw the thing away, right? And clay tablets would have been really expensive. Another crazy fun fact about ancient cuneiform of Mesopotamia is that it had over 2,000 characters. There's probably so many characters that archaeologists, haven't found them all. And so scribes in ancient Mesopotamia were a very important part of society, and they would make a lot of money because they were the very few that could read or write, but they took years of schooling in order to learn how to do it, right? So the big deal is that Sumer creates cuneiform. Cuneiform is a writing system that will inspire other ancient Rift Valley civilizations to create these complex systems of writing. Now, here's one of those clay tablets that ancient Sumer would have used, or ancient Mesopotamian city-states would have used. Now, you do see a circle, but they didn't chisel that circle out. It's like they pushed something into it, all right? So this is why you don't see a C or like a 0 where, things are connected. And so each of these symbols represented a sound, and you had to put them together in order to get words. So this would be an example of an ancient Mesopotamian, record. Historians of ancient Egypt and historians of ancient Mesopotamia often have this argument of which writing system emerged first. Did cuneiform emerge before hieroglyphics, or did hieroglyphics emerge before cuneiform? I don't know, guys. Most books that I've read said cuneiform emerged first, right? What I do know, though, is that if cuneiform emerged first, hieroglyphics was soon after that. Now, hieroglyphics in ancient Egypt, as you learned before, was of noble class. It would not have been something that the average citizen, the average person, would have been able to read or to use in ancient Egypt, right? Hieroglyphics is what gets the big focus in ancient Egypt, because that's the language of the wealthy class, of the royalty. That's the language that you see inside the tombs where pharaohs, would write these great histories about themselves, which they probably lied about and put all on the walls before they died, right? So as you went into their pyramid, they would tell you these great exaggeration stories of themselves, right? Now, what do we know about hieroglyphics? Well, we do know that, as you learned in the crash course lecture, that the pyramids were made out of limestone. So they were easily able to write hieroglyphics on them, chisel that into the pyramids. But unlike Mesopotamia, the Nile has papyrus, right? They have these big grass, tall grass growing out of the Nile. And from there, they could be able to take this grass and they would be able to lay it out and flatten it and make paper out of it, right? Now, what do we also know is that each of the symbols in hieroglyphics represented a sound. So they had over 5,000 characters in the beginning when they created hieroglyphics, when they were using, very early pictograms. But when they started getting very complex with it and they started making their characters into sounds, they went down to 5,000 characters to only 24. So a lot easier to remember 24 to be able to put together a sentence than it would be to remember 5,000 characters to put it into a sentence. So here's just a picture of a written record that a merchant of Egypt would have used, right? Papyrus, something that they would have been able to use to document their trade, or to document records of who owed them what. And on the right side of the slide, that's what the papyrus would have, looks like. That's what they would take out and dry out in order to make paper. Now, here's just a close view of hieroglyphics that was inside of a tomb, right? So even though hieroglyphics are pictures, and they're often pictures of animals, like I know you see the bird, and you see other symbols like an ox or a cow. Each of those symbols, remember, represented a sound. This is not pictograms, all right? These are sounds that people will put together to make words. All modern phonic alphabets, well, all modern with the exception of one, are derived from the Phoenician alphabet, right? So everybody in this class has been impacted by the Phoenicians. They had the greatest impact on almost every writing system in the world. Well, how did they do it? How did they have such a great impact? Well, what happens is around 2000 BCE, these guys take over Lebanon and they create these headquarters. And not only do they start taking over Lebanon, but they start creating these colonies all across the Mediterranean Sea, because they are basing their whole economy, their whole society, off on being sea traders and being able to connect different civilizations to each other based on trade. So they can take, wheat from the Nile, give it to the Mesopotamians, or take, wheat from Egypt and go take it to Spain, right? To take it all around the world. Well, they also get really good at the timber trade, and they'll take timber from places like, places that are colder in Asia, like in Russia today, and they could bring it down to places like Mesopotamia where they wouldn't have had any timber at all. Another thing that they get really great at is fashion. They learn very quickly that people need help with finding color on their clothes, right? So most clothes doesn't have any color whatsoever. It would have just been, everybody been wearing the same type of, of cloth. And so what do? Well, they find these murex snails, and they find out that when you squish these murex snails, that the color purple comes out. And the purple that these snails, squish out is dye. And they're going to start dyeing cloth with this, and this color purple becomes the color for people to get. Well, because it is the color, because it is the in color, it is so expensive that only royalty can afford to wear this color. And so the color purple throughout history, will become the color of royalty. It becomes a status symbol. All right. So these guys become these brave sea traders. They are the only ones crazy enough to sell the Mediterranean Sea. They're the only ones crazy enough to create maritime routes that go up rivers. And if you don't know what maritime means, maritime just basically means water routes, sea routes or river routes. And they are spreading all these goods all across the world. And not only are they spreading goods all across the world, but they're also spreading their alphabet. Because if you're going to be a sea trader, if you're going to base your whole economy off of trading, then you have to keep pretty complex records. And the ancient Phoenicians very quickly in society created an alphabet based on 22 symbols. Right now, if you look at the alphabet on the screen, you'll see that they didn't use vowels. Right, so even though they may have had vowels in their language, when they wrote, they left out the vowels. Okay, so they would spell love like LV. Okay, just as an example. Well, what happens? Well, every civilization that they touched basically took their alphabet and made their own. And one example of this is the ancient Greeks. The ancient Greeks took their alphabet and then they changed it to make it into a Greek alphabet. And then the Greeks gave their alphabet to the Romans. The Romans created Latin with it. And then Latin is the basis basically for almost every European language, all the Romance languages in the world. And then from there on to then on. Now, what did we do in the English language? Well, we took the Phoenician alphabet based off of the Latin alphabet, based off the Greek alphabet, and we add in some symbols. And what symbols do we add in? Well, we add in the vowel sounds. Now, what is the big deal with these two pictures? The big deal here is that, one, look at the world that the Phoenicians connected, right? So this is a big deal. This is how they're able to spread their language. This is why we say the word phonics in elementary school when we're teaching you how to sound out words, right? We're getting it from the word Phoenicia, right? They gave us our phonics. They gave us our language. And they were able to take that language and spread it all over the world because of their complex trade. And what did they write it on? Well, if you look down at the bottom, you'll see an example of how they wrote their language, of how the Phoenician alphabet was used to keep records of trade. Now, all these written records lead to a complex economy for ancient revised civilization, leads to the ideas that you can buy and sell and trade and keep track of money, leads to the idea of a banking system, but it also leads to the idea of history, and that history should start to be captured in civilizations, and should be written down, and should be remembered, right? Or should be exaggerated for other generations. And so this is very important, because history then, after being told and being written down in civilization, also starts to be reflected in cities' by their architects. They start wanting to show their history, by creating something like a wall and demonstrating, maybe leaders on that wall, right? Through these stories that were written. So these written records also become important because scholars start creating mathematics. They start creating engineering projects. And without a writing system, without a universal writing system that civilizations can agree on, you can't have people sit down and create, plans to build some great building in cities. Now, architecture becomes a major field for all ancient revised civilizations because they want to show off, right? They want to show you how much wealth their city has, how much beauty their city has. And this is an example of a Mesopotamian city-state, right, of their architecture. And architecture becomes hugely important in ancient Rift Valley civilizations because of protection again. I mean, if you look at this Mesopotamian city-state, if you look at this one city, you'll see that there are several walls that you would have to break through or enter before you even got in the city, right? So you would see a bridge that would overlap a river. You would also see that there were two set of walls that you would have to get through, and if you looked closely on top of the walls, you would see that they actually had roads on the walls. And the reasons why they had roads on the walls is so that the army could move, up and down those walls very quickly in case there was, invaders trying to break through their city-state. What else do you see? Well, if you look on your left-hand side of the screen, you'll see this this step-looking pyramid, and this was called a ziggurat in ancient Mesopotamia. Now, what were ziggurats? Well, ziggurats in ancient Mesopotamia were a place of worship. It was a temple of worship. And in ancient Rift Valley civilizations, people didn't go to the temples, right? The only people that lived in the temples were the priests, right? Or royalty would go there because religion was used by governments to centralize authority, to kind of back up of reasons why they were king, right? So in ancient Egypt, you learned in your lecture from Crash Course that the pharaohs would actually preach that they were half God, right? They believed that they were half God, so much so that they were willing to marry their own sister or brother in order to prove to other people that they were half God, because who else could they marry if they were half God, right? You couldn't marry somebody that wasn't half God because then your child would be only 1/4 God, right? So religion becomes a huge factor in ruling ancient Rift Valley civilizations. But if you take a moment to look at this, this also shows you how important religion was because, government officials would spend a lot of tax dollars on building these beautiful temples that people couldn't even attempt to go to. No. These ziggurats had a nickname called stairways to heaven because in ancient Mesopotamia, they built their ziggurats as close to the skies as they could. And these ziggurats, which you can see all up and down, Iraq, are thousands and thousands of years old. And the reason why they built them so tall is because they believed that their gods would actually walk down to them from the sky. And they believed that if they had to please their gods, then they wanted to make it, an easy entrance into their city. And each city-state in ancient Mesopotamia, of course, had their favorite god that they picked, kind of like the Greeks did and like the Romans did. And they would dedicate, this temple to that god. Now, I wanted to show you the picture of the U.S. soldiers on the ziggurat because I wanted to show you how well made these ziggurats are. I mean, these ziggurats have withstood, wars throughout history. They've withstood, sandstorms, earthquakes, and they're still around. I mean, this is some amazing piece of architecture. And remember, it would be all made out of bricks, out of clay, because they didn't have timber. Now, unlike the ziggurats, as you learned in Crash Course, the pyramids would not have been anywhere where the average person could have gone to, because the idea for ancient Rift Valley civilizations was not that temples or, or burial sites of pharaohs were places that the average people could go. I mean, relationships with the gods in every ancient Rift Valley civilization, you had to have a relationship through a priest, and it was that priest who had to pray for you. And of course, since the pharaohs were half god, well, then they could have their own temple, because they were assuming that they would have a better chance at getting into heaven than the average person. All ancient Rift Valley civilizations, with the exception of the Hebrews, right, with the exception of the Kingdom of Israel, are polytheistic. They believe in many gods. Remember, poly means many, all right? The only ancient River Valley civilization to be monotheistic is the Hebrews, or the ancient Israelites, or the Kingdom of Israel, okay? Now, what makes monotheism so different for the Hebrews is something that we're going to discuss in another lecture. What I want us to focus on right now is the polytheistic beliefs of the Sumerians, or the ancient Mesopotamians. You learned about the Egyptian religion in the crash course lecture, so I'm going to focus on Mesopotamia right here. I want you to look at the Mesopotamian gods, right? What do you see? Well, one, they're smiling. Some of them aren't smiling. Some of them look a little bit upset. Well, that's because the ancient Sumerians believed their gods had human qualities. And when I say their gods, I'm meaning they had over 3,000 gods. Now, the ancient Sumerians did not believe that their gods looked like them. Right? They believed that their gods looked different. They actually believed that their gods created humans because they got drunk one night and they got into a little bit of an argument, and they decided that the way to end this argument was that if they created people on earth so they could make fun of them and they could pick on people and give people a pretty hostile life that sucked really bad, and then the gods would laugh and then people here would suffer, right? Most ancient Mesopotamians also believed that whatever life you had here on earth was going to be the same thing in the afterlife, right? They did not believe in this concept of heaven, that everything was going to be fine if you worshiped your gods and you did what you were supposed to, right? That's completely different from the ancient Egyptians, who believed in this chance of, getting into a life of paradise. All right, and definitely different from the ancient Hebrews, who believed that you could have a relationship with God. In ancient Mesopotamia, like all polytheistic religions of ancient Rift Valley civilizations, you had a relationship with God or your gods through your priest. You yourself could not speak to a god or the gods, right? You could not pray to the gods or the gods. That's why priest and religious authority went hand in hand in ancient Rift Valley civilizations. Take a look at these three questions, right? These three questions have been answered by the lecture, right? So what would I like you to do? I would like for you to talk it over with a neighbor. I would like for you guys to, talk about what were the social, political, and economic characteristics of ancient Rift Valley civilizations. After you guys talk about those three things, I want you to talk about what were the religious traditions of ancient Rift Valley civilizations, and then three, what forms of languages and writings existed in ancient Rift Valley civilizations. Those three questions are crucially important to the test.